Well, we're back again, Whiskey Politics and the Ricochet.com podcast, where we are still at the Weekly Standard Cruise. And delighted to have with us Mark Hemingway, senior writer for the Weekly Standard. Thank you for joining us, Mark.
Glad to be here.
Appreciate it. So one of the things I want to jump right into right now is an editorial that is about to come out. By the time folks see this, it will be out, so people can find it very easily. And that is your concern about some of the discussions of Obamacare being replaced and the time factors that are involved in that. What are your biggest concerns about Obamacare moving forward?
Well, for starters, if we learned anything in 2016 is we cannot take the future of politics for granted. Things look very good for Republicans right now. Obviously we control the majority of state legislatures, the vast majority of governorships, and the House and the Senate, and now the White House. But the idea that in an era of populist revolt and, is defined by political instability, the idea that we were going to have control of all three, major branches of government there in 2 years after the next election is I just don't think you can make that assumption. So therefore, you need to come right out of the gate and do some things. And the number one priority for Republicans should be, dealing with Obamacare. I mean, recall what happened in 2010 as people started rebelling against Obama for the first time. Voters elected a Republican senator to replace Ted Kennedy in Massachusetts to stop Obamacare.
Wow.
When that ploy failed, what happened then? Voters went to the voting booth in the fall of 2010 and handed the Democrats the worst defeat for a major party since the end of World War II. And then Obama did survive re-election, but that was only because he lied through his teeth about what the law actually, did and what its impacts would be. And when, it was a rolling disaster as it was implemented, it was arguably the most effective issue for Republicans when they retook the Senate in 2014. So after all of that, Obamacare is the cornerstone of the Republican resurgence post-Obama. And if you come into office promising repeal and replace for 6 years and you just kind of do a half-hearted repeal and leave 22 million people who have health insurance through the law, however substandard that coverage might be, hanging, that's going to be something that would, justly poke voters right in the eye.
There's been several plans that have been brought up by the Republican Congress, even through Obama's administration, none of which obviously made it to the desk. But one of the key areas that have been of concern, which the media will sensationalize beyond, is the letting those 20 million people that have since gotten health care coverage focused on, and what happens to those individuals. And really the key factor, I guess the question is, what should the messaging be? Because we all know it's about messaging right now.
Right. Well, I think that they really need to come out of the gate and emphasize the aspects of the plan that do sort of fix existing problems in the healthcare system we all know exist and we all know need to be dealt with. Pre-existing conditions is a big one. There wasn't a lot of talk about Trump's policy specifics, but he did come out and lay out some specifics for a healthcare replacement plan. And part of that, he quietly, there wasn't much discussion about it because heaven forbid people talk about the fact that Trump actually had policy ideas. He came out quietly in August and added high-risk pools to his plan, meaning that it was a priority for the Trump administration to make sure people with pre-existing conditions were taken care of. And then similarly, you can, even the people that have Obamacare insurance as it is right now, what rates are going up an average of 22% next year. I mean, it is so exorbitantly expensive for even people that have Obamacare. I think that it would be hard for people to argue that the law is working and that we should keep it in place. But again, it speaks to why we can't just repeal and delay. And we got to have an answer right away. Republicans do have fixes. There are a number of off-the-shelf legislative proposals, and it's a simple GOP leadership test to take one of those off-the-shelf legislative plans or combine the best elements of a few of them and just push it through Congress as promptly as they can.
Moving from Obamacare, which is obviously a boondoggle and very, very expensive, we are now hearing a lot about talk of infrastructure. And one of the discussion points that we've heard a lot about this week is Trump as a populist is coming in and he's talking about spending a lot of money on different projects. As a conservative, free market guy, how do you quantify the two, where you want to obviously appease those individuals that want to talk about infrastructure and those on the left that are welcoming this to reality of budgets and $20 trillion debt?
Well, first off, right off the bat, the way that the people in the Trump administration have been talking about infrastructure has me a little worried. Steve Bannon, I think, has thrown around $1 trillion infrastructure plan and has said that we need to do this because interest rates are so low, it'd be stupid not to take advantage of it. This was almost the exact rationale for the Obama stimulus, which I think most people now agree was something of a failure. So that has me worried. Having said that, infrastructure need not be opposed to the conservative definition of limited government. I mean, you go back to Alexander Hamilton, and they expressly laid out constitutional arguments for the federal government playing a role in infrastructure. Everything from, telegraph, railroads to West Point was in fact founded specifically with the idea that it would supply America with the engineers it needed to build the projects that it needed to have built. So it is not anti-American to have infrastructure, but the key conception of American infrastructure that's different is that the government should be doing big infrastructure projects that allow other entrepreneurs and other businessmen to take advantage of that infrastructure to do more dynamic things and to allow private business to capitalize on that infrastructure. And certainly there are things that we could do. We need much more broadband in this country, and we're certainly behind other countries in that regard. And
on the ship.
Yeah, on the ship. There are other things that we could do, I think, that would be a boon to private business development. And certainly, Peter Thiel.
Right.
is a brilliant technologist and would be a wonderful guy to step in here. Peter Thiel, call your office and advise Trump on what we could do to use government infrastructure to create a sort of a startup culture and other things that would benefit the economy overall and maybe actually create jobs rather than just be another government infrastructure boondoggle.
So to those that are saying $20 trillion, I mean, we shouldn't be spending anything. We should just be cutting and slashing. Do you believe that the private marketplace will sufficiently answer that by running efficiencies? And the second question, and those that look at those advocates of the private marketplace, is that, well, there really isn't the infrastructure project companies that are out there. There's very, very few people that are able to do that, a la Obamacare's website.
Right. Well, let me just be clear here. What I laid out was the best case scenario for infrastructure, within the American conception of limited self-government, right? The reality, as we know, of Washington, D.C. is that infrastructure bills tend to be a boondoggle. They tend to be what we call Christmas trees, where everybody, adds their own little pet infrastructure project to it, regardless of whether it is a good economic plan on the whole. So I think overall we should be very, very, on alert about big infrastructure plans. I don't think we need to be needlessly, pessimistic about it, but I wouldn't be overly optimistic about it either.
Okay. Last domestic issue I would like to discuss with you. Obviously, the polls got it wrong.
Right.
Media is lowest trust level I can ever remember being reported. From your standpoint, what do news institutions and publications, conservative, liberal, and all points in between, how do they start using polls in the future? And what does that look like?
Well, one, they just need to use polls a lot less. And something very interesting has happened, which is to say that we were kind of in a polling bubble in 2008 and 2012. In particular, Nate Silver was something of a rogue genius who really did a lot of things to revolutionize the polling industry. For one, he started emphasizing polling averages, which actually did produce more accurate results. And then in 2012, he came out and predicted 50 out of 50 states correctly in a presidential election, which was just, this incredible feat as far as pollsters were concerned. So he was almost a victim of his own success. And Silver, to his credit, saw this coming. He kept warning that pollsters were sort of getting high on their own supply. And more than that, his own ideas got so embedded in the mainstream that they no longer seem to work, because polling is kind of like a self-actualizing thing. When everybody talks about polls, that people think about the polls when they answer the polls, and just everything gets all haywire. Right. And that's a lot of what happened. And Nate Silver reported this in 2014. What you saw is a lot of pollsters, as they got closer to Election Day in 2014, started having polling results that showed very similar to other polls, whereas maybe they'd previously been a bit of an outlier. And that's everybody looking over their shoulder instead of trusting their own instincts and reporting what they think is accurate. And this year we saw something very interesting, which is to say that Trump was a very, very unusual candidate, and he in a lot of ways existed outside the typical realm of polling. There was a guy named Robert Cahaley that ran an outfit called the Trafalgar Group, that was, I think, the most accurate pollster in 6 swing states, and I believe he was the only guy to pick Pennsylvania and Michigan correctly for Trump. And he did something very interesting, which is that he noticed that when he did a robo poll, which is call someone on the phone, press 1 with a recorded message for the candidate A, press 2 for candidate B, Trump's support was significantly higher and all across the country than when they were talking to a live human being. And he surmised that he thought that people were afraid to admit that to a real person that they were going to vote for Trump. So he started asking people, who did your neighbor vote for? And sure enough, he had much more accurate results because people could sort of shift the blame off them personally. Oh, that guy Trump, I'm not going to vote for him, but my neighbor down the street. So there's a lot of lessons here, I think, for people, how they approach polling in terms of what, how much emphasis they put on it and how much they use it.
We also saw some outlier polls that did seem to come through this year. You had the LA Times USC poll, and you had the ITP poll, where they were tracking people, the same people, every single day. Is that something you think can be duplicated in the future?
Depending on how you look at the tracking poll, I think that poll had sort of the direction right, but I think the final results were a bit off. I don't remember the technical aspects.
They were closer than most, though.
Yes, but on the whole, tracking polls have been very inaccurate, and in fact, Gallup stopped doing it after 2012 because they were sort of embarrassed because it seemed to be showing consistently a pro-Romney bias. But again, a daily tracking poll is another example of what I'm talking about. I mean, people literally waking up every morning saying, "What's the poll?" We need to get away from that mentality. I mean, the fact of the matter is if you looked at this election and just looked at the fundamentals, what party was in the White House and all the historical indicators, everything favored Trump. So it shouldn't have been a big mystery that he won. The only mystery was that, the polls were off, 2 to 3 points in the wrong direction, which is, more or less in the margin of error. It just wasn't what everyone wanted to believe, and they interpreted the results from the polls that they wanted to see.
Okay. I want to talk more from a global perspective briefly here. Brexit. We just saw Italy. Obviously, the United States. Some people say it's obviously globalism is a big concern for people. The elites are big concerns, and there's a lot of anger out there. But one of the things that you've discussed is that the trust level in institutions is way down. You want to discuss that further?
Well, so this is interesting because I have a colleague of mine at Weekly Standard named Chris Caldwell wrote a book in 2009 called Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, Islam Immigration in the West, where he talked about the fact that how our conventional liberal response to issues like immigration and terrorism was going to lead to a populist backlash. And he said this long before the rise of ISIS, long before Brexit or any of this. And it's been sort of fascinating, to see that the United States is sort of downstream from Europe on these issues. But that's exactly it. I mean, all of our institutions have this sort of guiding, classically liberal philosophy that I think is wholly inadequate to deal with large populations of people, for instance, that are going to sort of abuse that trust. We have these, collective notions and beliefs in the West that I don't think that I think are fraying, and it's something that we really have to think about because the populism, again. There are elements of populism that can be good. Ronald Reagan was very populist in a certain way, but then there are elements of populism that are obviously bad. And what I worry about is that when we take the kind of underpinnings of our constitutional system, things like rule of law, and when people start believing that we can't rely on these foundational concepts, they're going to start voting for strong men. And what I worry about is that people looked at sort of the Democratic order under Obama, where he did everything under executive order or unilaterally, and they look at that and they say, well, they don't believe in rule of law, so and Obama acted like a despot or a strongman, so I want my own strongman that's going to impose my will on those people after 8 years of them imposing their will on me, and that is a very dangerous situation to be in.
You could relate that to also some of the cronyism you're seeing right now. People are calling it free markets, but a lot of people will call it crony capitalism with Carrier and other institutions. Well, as long as our side gets it.
Right.
As long as we're taken care of.
And yeah, and that's very dangerous. Making a political gesture for 1,000 jobs here and there isn't like the worst thing, but it's the question of the tone and the example it sets. If it simply becomes the government picking winners and losers constantly, yeah, absolutely, it's terrifying.
Continuing on the global perspective, obviously ISIS, the resurgence of Al-Qaeda, which we don't hear a lot about in the media still, which is incredible to me, but, GM's alive, Al-Qaeda's dead. No, Al-Qaeda's definitely strong these days. If you were a fly in Trump's ear, and obviously the cabinet that he's just put forth is very pro-security, national security, what would be your biggest concern right now with some of the actions or lack of actions that have taken place from Syria, the Red Line, all the way up to where we are right now with some of the attacks that have taken place in Europe across the world?
Well, Trump really did try and thread a needle, and I think he threaded it sort of smartly. The question is how you translate that into action, which is to say the American population is very weary of war. I mean, we're still in Afghanistan, and it's the longest running war the United States has ever had. Right. At the same time, he knows full well that what was going on in the Obama administration is they're being taken advantage of by the Russians and Iranians and other, bad actors around the world because they were perceived as weak. So the challenge here is how do you project American strength while simultaneously making sure you don't get involved in any sort of long, protracted conflicts. It's not as hard as that may sound. I don't think that's an impossible thing to do. You used to be much more clear about the United States' intentions. You need to not try and almost single-handedly remake the Middle Eastern map, which is what the Obama administration did by trying to, elevate Iran as the major player in the arena, despite the fact that Iran is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. So I think you need to just reset things in terms of reassuring American allies and say, hey, America, as you know it, is back on the block, and you've traditionally been our ally. Forget what the last guy did. We're going to be here for you, Saudi Arabia. We're going to be here for you, Israel. You let us know what you need, and we can project our strength through those allies who are chomping to get some sort of stability back there and might be more willing to exert their own influence in the region than they would have previously been because of the way that we've been so hands off.
What do you do with the Iran deal?
You throw it out the window. And the Iran deal in retrospect is just crazy, but it was very typical of what the Obama administration did on all fronts. I kind of call it government by gaslight, which is that they would arrive at this ridiculously unpopular political agenda, and then they would tell a bunch of lies designed to soften support. In this case, they lied to Congress explicitly about, there were certain nuclear sites that are self-inspecting and all these other problems with the Iran deal. Then they got this media echo chamber to, go out there and, tell everyone you're crazy to oppose this thing. And then when, all the lies were exposed, the plan was already in place, and they'd turn right around and say, what, you're crazy. Everyone knew this was going to be the case. I mean, the whole thing was done in such bad faith, both with Congress and the American people. I don't see any reason to honor the deal at all. And certainly Iran hasn't acted like they honored the deal. There have been several things just in recent weeks where Iran has violated the terms of the deal. So, why feel bound by it at all?
Yet President Rouhani just reported yesterday or a couple of days ago that if America was to repeal that, then there would be obviously repercussions. And as he said that, the audience went into chants of death to America.
Right. Well, Iranians chanting death to America, what is it, a day ending in Y? Look, we can't let the president of Iran boss us around and intimidate us. It's just, full stop. There's any number of things that we can do. The fact of the matter is the economic sanctions were hurting that country dearly, and I think we need to go back to imposing those and, maybe even enforcing tougher sanctions. Right. Because as much as they want to pretend that they're not scared by us, the reality is that we can hurt Iran a lot, and without firing a single shot.
You mentioned Israel, and I was in Israel recently, and although they weren't in love with the man Trump, they despise the policies of Obama. And while everybody not supports Trump personally, again, they're happy that there is a different shift change. What do we do from the standpoint of the UN and Israel and the support or lack of support that the UN has pushed? With a moral, equivalence between the Palestinians and Hamas mostly and Israel?
Right. Well, it was obvious that the Obama administration loathed Israel and loathed Netanyahu in particular. So now we have an all-new UN ambassador, and just by throwing our weight around again, if the UN tries to go after Israel, we can step up, and there's all kinds of other priorities the UN will want the U.S. involved in. So they're going to be a lot less inclined to do any of this anti-Israel stuff, which is garbage to begin with, if they know that it's going to upset the U.S. And they've been just pushing the envelope for the last 8 years because they knew that Obama hated Netanyahu. And again, we just need to signal that those days are over. We're back to a much more conventional vision of American foreign policy.
Yeah, and I think that message is being made loud and clear. Well, last question for you. You mentioned Obamacare as being one of the primary, one of the most important things for Trump and his administration to focus on in the next 100 days. If you were to have one or two more other areas that they should really target right out of the gate, what would those be?
Well, I think the Supreme Court is the other obvious thing. That was a major justification. A lot of people voted for him. People tried to figure out why so many evangelicals and religious types would vote for Trump, despite his, personal peccadillos and personal issues. And I think that's the answer. And Trump cannot not reward these people. And it has to be a solid conservative pick. And I think that won't be a problem. Partially because Mike Pence is very committed to these issues personally, and if Trump does anything wacky, Pence can exert a lot of pressure from the inside, and that is sort of a reassuring thought for conservatives. Beyond that, I don't really know. This is the big thing. I mean, everybody's trying to read the tea leaves on the Trump administration. I do think that just resetting the table, letting people know that the Defense Department has different priorities in terms of foreign policy, and clearing, getting people a sense that, energy policy is going to be more sane. You can do a lot of things to just sort of, subtly signal that things are going to be returning back to normal.
Well, if Obamacare and SCOTUS are the two first things, I think that will satiate a lot of those individuals that were concerned he wasn't conservative enough.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time, Mark. Enjoy the rest of your trip, and we look forward to seeing more articles coming out in the Weekly Standard.
Glad to be here.
Thank you so much.